There. If you're watching this video at roughly the intended time, you are about to move beyond talking about some of the skills elements of the AP exam and to start trying to dive into the content. And so I wanted to take this opportunity to talk to you about a document that might or might not be extremely helpful in that task, which is the CED, the course and exam description. And I'll start with actually just some general tips for reviewing this massive quantity of human activity that you are accountable for on the AP exam. And then I'll show you how to use this particular PDF that I think is particularly important. So a couple of general principles for studying, because you have a large volume of information in front of you that you might be trying to cram back into your head over the next few weeks. The most important thing I'll suggest is that this is the stage in the review process where you really want to use what you have. You do not need to be, you do not want to be learning brand new content at this point. You do not need to find a new textbook. You do not need to start a new notebook necessarily. This is not the time to be reinventing the wheel. This is the time to try and identify what worked for you in terms of learning, remembering, reviewing content when you were taking this class, and to go back to that, to play to your strengths as much as possible. So don't. This is a time where you really want to be revisiting some of those old materials. You have old homework guides, you have old textbook notes, you have old graded writing practices, that kind of thing. You want to be returning to that instead of seeking out brand new materials all the time. That's not to say you shouldn't supplement if you have a YouTube channel that you like or something like that. And in fact, I think that's a really helpful strategy. But you want to start from what you already know, and you want to start with the class materials that you're familiar with. Number two, my strong recommendation is that you make a schedule for your review, that you not try to be bouncing around from time period to time period or from region to region, that you plan out what you're going to do in advance. And that's particularly important because parts of this exam are going to require you to be able to nail down in which time period specific events happened. And it's more helpful if you're going to be able to review in an order that roughly corresponds to like the time periods that the exam is going to use. You have the schedule. It is in your review session schedule. But I'll just remind you, we're going to go starting after the April break. Our review sessions are just going to go period by period. So we'll cover that post-classical era in the period between 1200 and 1450 on the first Wednesday after break. On May 5th, we'll do the early modern era from 1450 to 1750. On the 12th, we'll do the late modern era from 1750 to 1900. On the 19th, we'll try and wrap up with the 20th century, everything that's happened roughly since 1900 or World War I, you pick. And then the exam day is Thursday the 20th. And so my recommendation, if you want kind of a ready-made schedule for review, is that you try to have your review of each of those periods done by the start of that review session, which means that over the April break, you want to be starting to think back to the Mongols, think back to the global tapestry, Song China, all of that stuff. The next week, you want to do your early modern review, and so on and so forth. So you have those facts fresh in your head when we use them for our practice questions during each of those review sessions. That's my recommendation, but it really will be helpful to you if you make a schedule and try and break down this vast volume of material into some more manageable chunks. Finally, AP World History is a widely taught course. People with way higher production values than me have been making videos about it that are way better than mine on YouTube, even before the era of pandemic-induced distance learning came to a beginning. And so I would really recommend that you find one or two YouTube channels that are good for you and use those to introduce you to a new unit, to brush up on stuff that's kind of vaguely familiar to you. Heimler's History and then Freemanpedia are probably the big ones. There's a Khan Academy crash course series. Those two have joined forces. There's some other recommendations in the various review materials that I've made available to you, but really do seek out those resources. There's some really good ones online that will do some stuff for you that these review materials that I'm producing are not going to do. Not that my channel isn't the best channel in the whole entire internet, but if you have to look at another one, Heimler or Freeman are probably the ways to go. Okay. A new thing, a thing that I don't think we've really talked about in this course this year, is that might be helpful in guiding your review, is a big PDF called the Course and Exam Description. I've started providing links to that in your review schedule. I've started pointing you to the specific units that I think you might want to look through in advance of every review session. And so I'm just going to talk for the rest of this video about how you can access and use this document. The CED, as I will generally refer to it for the rest of your life, or the course and exam description, is a College Board issued document that's kind of the Bible of this course for AP teachers. And its audience is primarily teachers. It contains a lot of detail that is not necessarily going to be relevant to your life or your exam preparation, but it can be useful to you. So I'll try and break down the parts that are going to be useful to students preparing for this exam. The first 40, 45 pages of this big PDF are going to be some boilerplate information about like what the AP is and why it's great for everybody. But what you really want to skip down to is this section called the unit guides. There are 9 units in this course according to the College Board. And those unit guides, those few dozen pages, will outline all of the historical content that is required for this course. I just said there are 9 units, but I taught you this course in 4 units because I schedule a little bit differently. So let me walk you through the breakdown of how those things correspond. Units 1 and 2 are going to talk about are the post-classical period from 1200 to 1450. Unit 1, as I am fond of saying in the College Board world, is the global tapestry, where they just kind of bounce around from region to region and tell you what's going on. And what you're looking, this screenshot that you're looking at on the right-hand side of your screen, is just the first subtopic in the College Board's version of Unit 1. Right? So it'll be developments in East Asia from 1200 to 1450. There will be a section for developments in the Islamic world, a section for developments in South Asia, etc., etc. Unit 2, also in that same time period, covers networks of exchange. So it's going to talk about the Silk Roads, the Trans-Saharan trade, the Indian Ocean trade, trade in the Americas. So same time period, but different theme. So units 1 and 2 in the course and exam description are the same as Unit 1 or Period 1 or the post-classical era in my course. Units 3 and 4 correspond to my Period 2, 1450 to 1750. Units 5 and 6 in the CED corresponds to my late modern period. And then units 7, 8, and 9 all cover the post-1900 type stuff, world wars, etc., etc. So just so you know, I will give you those correspondences every time I suggest that you review a couple of units, but do know that the numbering is different. And sometimes if you're seeking out outside materials that other AP World teachers have made, if you hear them referring to Unit 7, they're probably referring to the College Board's Unit 7. When you scroll through this massive PDF, and I've just given you the screenshot of the first page that you're going to want to look at in reviewing that post-classical era, 1200 to 1450, you'll see these things that say thematic focus that you can kind of ignore because they're going to repeat over and over and over again. What you really want to look at is these 2 sections on each page called Learning Objective and Historical Developments. Learning objectives describe what you should be able to do after studying that topic. So in this case, you should be able to explain the systems of government employed by Chinese dynasties and how they developed over time. And then I think the single most useful thing to look at is this historical developments, which kind of gives you a sentence or 2 length overview of like the things that happened corresponding to this topic that you need to know. So this first sentence is going to be this boilerplate statement that will appear in almost every region in Unit 1 in the global tapestry. Empires and states in Afro-Eurasia and the Americas demonstrated continuity, innovation, and diversity in the 13th century. That's kind of true everywhere. You'll see that over and over again. And then in the second sentence here, they're going to get a little bit more specific about exactly what you need to know for this topic. This included the Song dynasty of China, which utilized traditional methods of Confucianism and an imperial bureaucracy to maintain and justify its rule. And when you read those historical developments carefully, what you're going to start noticing is vocabulary words that are really important. If a vocabulary word appears in the historical development section, you're accountable for it. It's fair game for them to ask you about that on the AP exam. So for this one, the 3 vocab words that I'm going to pay attention to that should be jumping out to me as I skim this section are the Song dynasty, right? I need to be able to describe some things about the Song dynasty. I might want to say, for instance, this is considered the golden age of China. I might want to be able to explain the dynastic system in general. I'm going to be thinking about Confucianism, right? The ways in which Confucianism is a through line through much of Chinese imperial history, the particular values associated with Confucianism that are going to have impacts for politics and for social organization, the ways Confucians think about merchants, for instance, as opposed to farmers. Those things should be popping up in my head. head. And then the last word I want to pay attention to is bureaucracy. I want to be thinking about the civil service exams. I want to be thinking about the relatively high social status of civil servants. I want to be thinking about the kind of possibilities of meritocracy that exist in Song China because of this standardized testing system, and about the reality that upper class families are much more likely to be able to get their sons the time and the resources to study in order to pass that exam, right? So all of these things, these are the key terms that I want to pay attention to, and that's the level of information that I want to be popping up in my head. One last thing about the CED. Let's flip over to the next page. There's like 3 of these little blue boxes for each theme in topic 1.1, developments in East Asia. So I'm just going to the next page of this PDF. That's what the screenshot is showing you. So you'll look down through these other learning objectives and historical developments. And then sometimes you will see these things in the right-hand margin or left-hand margin called illustrative examples. And you will see a whole long bullet-pointed list of some pretty specific stuff. So let me walk you through what to do when you see these long lists in the margins. What these are doing is they're taking some information in the historical developments and trying to elaborate on them without telling you that everything is required, right? So if I'm reading this first historical development over here, it's reading Chinese cultural traditions continued and they influenced neighboring regions. That's a pretty generic statement. If you write on the exam, Chinese cultural traditions continued by itself, you're not going to get a whole lot of points for anything. So what they have done is said, well, hey, let's take a look at some examples of cultural traditions that continued in China in this period that your teacher might want to zone in on, right? And so over in that margin, you'll see here are some examples of cultural traditions. None of those are required. I'm not required to teach all of them. You're not required to know all of them. But because just saying Chinese cultural traditions continued in its own right is not a very interesting or historically compelling statement, you probably want to have one or more examples of those in your back pocket. So let's read down this list. Filial piety in East Asia, that's a term that we've used in class a couple of times, referring to this expectation that people be deferential to people in superior social positions, whether that's, for instance, children to their parents, or wives to their husbands, or inferiors to their superiors, right? Civil servants to the emperor, et cetera, et cetera. So that's a cultural tradition that continues throughout Song China. We might say, oh, there's a continuing influence of Neo-Confucianism and Buddhism in East Asia, right? That's another example of a continuing cultural tradition, because neither of those things is brand new with the Song dynasty. We have this list of ideas of Confucian beliefs about women, the role of women in society. We've talked a little bit about that. But some of these illustrative examples will actually not be at all familiar to you, right? And so we did not talk about literary and scholarly traditions at all. We didn't really talk about their spread to Japan or Korea, and that's okay. You're not required to learn every single thing on this list of illustrative examples, but you do probably want to have 1 or 2 that you can pull out of your back pocket. So when you're looking through the CED, when you're looking for this particular information, don't make a flashcard for every single illustrative example, but do make a point of reviewing the ones that are familiar to you, the ones that you know that we've talked about in class, because they're not necessarily going to ask you a question that's directly like, what's the role of women in Confucianism? But they're quite likely to ask you a question that you can answer if you have some specific historical evidence about the role of women in Confucianism. You could do the same thing for Buddhism, which is specified in here, et cetera, et cetera. You won't see those on every single page, but when they pop up, just know you don't have to memorize the entire list. Not all of it should be familiar to you. We simply don't have time in this course, and that's fine. So, in sum, what do you do? Because every week from now on in our review sessions, I'm going to suggest, hey, you might want to look through units 1 and 2 of the CED before we meet. And so my recommendation first is that you review those before each review session. When you are doing those, you want to make a note of 2 categories of things. Number 1, you want to make a note of the required vocabulary in the historical content section in those light blue boxes, right? That's what you want to be underlining. That's what you want to be studying. That's what you want to be reviewing. You want to be able to use those things in sentences, make flashcards, do a Quizlet, whatever floats your boat. And then you also want to make a note of the illustrative examples that you already know, because those are not fair game for them to just directly ask you to recall every single one, but they're going to be very, very, very useful in writing your short answer in your DBQ responses, right? Like a lot of outside evidence points come in the DBQ come directly from that list of illustrative examples or from that required vocabulary in the CED. So those are the specific things that you want to focus on when you're reviewing these units. The other thing that you want to do when you're reading through each of these unit guides is to think about the big picture, right? Because often the most straightforward way to write an intro paragraph to earn the contextualization point in your DBQ is to basically just figure out, hey, it seems as if this DBQ is going to ask me about a specific topic in Unit 5, the Industrial Revolution. And so I am going to, before zooming into that specific topic with my thesis, I am going to describe some broader historical developments related to that prompt. Where might I find that? Elsewhere in Unit 5. Right? So you also want to have in your head kind of the big picture, high-level view of world history, where you can just describe in a couple of sentences what's happening in each unit broadly before zooming into these specific questions that you know they're going to ask you on the exam. All right, that's it. I will leave you to go get acquainted with this big PDF. The link is all over my review schedules. It'll be in the description of this video as well. Of course, ask me if you have any questions, but please have a really wonderful time with your brand new friend, the course and exam description. Sorry to all your other friends. Thank you. I will see you soon.